There is a kind of exhaustion that makes you want to return to something whose ending you already know, not because you're afraid of surprises, but because you no longer have the bandwidth for another decision. You don't need a plot. You need familiarity quiet enough for your mind to rest. This doesn't mean you're moving backward. It means you've learned how to keep yourself steady. When the day has stretched far beyond what it should have, your mind no longer looks for novelty. It looks for a place that asks nothing of you. You hold the remote in your hand. Your thumb moves past row after row of thumbnails. Each image appears like an invitation and at the same time, a demand. An action movie? No. Too loud for right now. A psychological drama? No. Too heavy. A documentary? No. You don't want to follow along, don't want to learn anything else. You don't put these thoughts into words. Your body answers before your mind catches up. The longer you scroll, the clearer it becomes. Every option costs energy. And right now, energy is something you don't have to spare. No movie is wrong. It's just that none of them are light enough. Then you stop. Not because you found something better, but because you saw something that didn't require another decision. The same movie, the same thumbnail, the same title you've seen dozens of times. You don't need to read the description. You don't need to watch the trailer. You don't need to ask yourself whether you'll like it. You already know, in the house, the lights have been turned down. Not to set a mood, but because your eyes and your mind don't want more light. You move toward your usual seat. The sofa sinks just slightly, a small sound you recognize instantly. Your shoulders drop. No one tells you to. No one gives permission. A breath leaves your body, slower, longer, as if you finally found solid ground. The glow from the TV is enough to see, but not enough to push away the darkness around you. The room feels as though it's closing in on itself, like a cocoon. Here, nothing needs an immediate response. If you've done this many times before, there may have been moments when you wondered whether this meant you were being lazy, whether returning to what's familiar was a sign that you were losing interest in life. But the truth is much simpler. All day long, you've been choosing how to respond, choosing what matters, choosing what can wait. Small decisions, but strung together without pause. By the end of the day, your mind has no room for one more choice. It doesn't need something new. It needs quiet. And familiarity delivers that faster than anything else. You don't come back because you lack options. You come back because today has asked too much of you. Outside this room, everything keeps moving. The news continues to update. New trends keep appearing. But in here, nothing asks you to keep up. You don't need to prove that you're still curious. You don't need to prove that you're still adaptable. You don't need to prove anything at all. Familiarity doesn't make you smaller. It simply gives you space to stop bracing yourself. And if you feel your breath soften the moment the familiar movie begins, that isn't an accident. It's a sign that your mind is trying to restore balance after a day that drained too much from you. This moment is easy to overlook. Not everyone allows themselves to stop at the right time. But if you're here now, in this quiet house, with a movie whose ending you already know, it may be because this moment, too, is familiar to you, knowing when no more choices are needed. Tonight, there are no more decisions to make. And if you feel calmer in this familiarity, that isn't by chance. There's something people often misunderstand about evenings like this. They assume you're avoiding something, that you don't want to face anything new. But what's actually happening is much simpler. Your mind is asking for rest. Not the kind of rest that comes from giving up, but the kind that follows sustained effort. All day long, your brain has been processing. Not just work, but things far smaller than that. Messages that needed replies, decisions that seemed trivial, details you had to remember, weigh, anticipate. Each one takes a tiny slice of energy. But added together, by the end of the day, there isn't much left. And at that point, anything new becomes more work. A new movie, even an interesting one, still asks something of you. You have to follow along, understand the context, remember characters' names, pay attention to what's happening. It requires your presence, your readiness to respond, your openness to the unknown. A familiar movie doesn't. You already know its rhythm. You know which parts you can drift through, which moments don't need your focus. You can let it play while your thoughts slowly decelerate. This isn't because you've lost the ability to concentrate. It's because you no longer need to. In the house right now, you don't turn on every light. You switch off the overhead ones. You leave a lamp on. The light is softer, not harsh. It doesn't force your eyes to stay alert. The room is bright enough to exist in, but not bright enough to keep you awake beyond what's necessary. That familiar movie works the same way. It provides just enough sound to keep you from feeling alone, but not enough noise to wake the part of your brain that needs to sleep. This is a very natural way of reducing the load. The same is true for your mind. When you choose something familiar, you lower the amount of information it has to process to the bare minimum. There's no need to guess what comes next. No tension around surprises, no preparation for reaction. Familiarity allows your mind to loosen its guard, and that, in itself, creates a very specific sense of safety. Not safety because everything is good, but safety because everything is known. You know how this part ends. You know the pacing. You know nothing will demand an immediate response. And on a day filled with things that required you to react, that is enough. Many people call this state calm. But calm here isn't happiness or excitement. It's the absence of demand. No one is waiting for your decision. No one needs you to keep up. Nothing needs to be proven. The familiar sounds continue, soft, steady. You don't need to pay attention. You only need to be there. And this doesn't need to be judged as good or bad. It usually appears when a limit has been reached. When your mind has worked all day, what it needs isn't more stimulation, it's fewer demands. That's why familiarity brings a sense of calm again so quickly. Not because it's more entertaining, but because it takes nothing more from you. This isn't avoidance. It's how the mind reduces its load after a full day of work. And when you realize that this calm comes from not having to react, not having to predict, not having to process anything else, you begin to understand something important. Sometimes, calm is simply the absence of anything asking for a response. On evenings like this, familiarity isn't a lesser choice. It's the right one for the moment. And that's only part of why familiarity can be so powerful. But there's another reason familiarity holds such power. There's a very specific reason why newness starts to feel heavy at the end of the day. Not because it's bad, but because it's expensive. Expensive not in terms of money, but in terms of entry cost. Anything new carries an invisible price that your mind has to pay before it can enjoy it. A new movie, from the very first minute, asks you to invest. Learn the characters' names, figure out who's who, understand how they're connected, follow the plot, remember what matters, pay attention to what might happen next. And, just as importantly, accept risk. The risk that the movie won't be good. The risk that you'll spend your time and get nothing worthwhile in return. When your energy is already depleted, a bad movie isn't just a mediocre experience. It feels like a theft. It takes 2 precious hours from the end of your day and gives you disappointment instead. That's a price you don't want to pay tonight. To keep up with something new, your brain has to light up like turning on every light in the house at night. Bright, clear, but harsh. It forces your eyes to open wider, forces alertness, forces readiness. With a new movie, you can't drift. You can't look away. You can't be loosely present. It demands full attention. And at the end of a long day, that demand is costly. By contrast, the familiar has almost no entry fee. Entry cost, 0. You don't need to relearn the characters' names. You don't need to reconstruct the world. You don't worry about missing something important. You already know its rhythm. You know which parts can fade into the background, which moments don't require your focus. You can let it play without bracing yourself to follow every detail. It's like the bedside lamp in the room right now. Not bright enough to wake you up further, but enough to keep you from complete darkness. Just enough light. For the brain, this just enough is a crucial signal. It says, you don't need to stay on guard. You don't need to predict. You don't need to prepare a response. And that's when the mind begins to loosen. When you engage with something familiar, your brain doesn't have to process from scratch. It recognizes patterns, recognizes rhythm, recognizes structure. Everything feels easier, not because it's better, but because it's already known. This repetition creates a very particular sensation. Comfort without effort, no excitement required, no climax needed, just no additional energy spent. That's one way to understand why familiar things so often bring a sense of stability. When the brain knows what's coming next, it doesn't need to stay in a ready state. No vigilance, no defense. On a day filled with demands for reaction, that release feels unmistakably relieving. And when choices become too many, the mind naturally gravitates back toward what it already knows. Not because you don't want to explore, but because every new option is another decision, another chance for disappointment, another thing to evaluate, another task to process. At a certain point, the brain quietly asks, why pay an extra cost when all I need is a state of calm? That's when the familiar starts to make sense, not because it's perfect, but because it costs nothing more. You don't choose the old because you fear the new. You choose the old because tonight, the entry fee for the new is simply too high. In the house right now, you don't turn on more lights. You keep the lighting low, not because you can't make it brighter, but because you don't need to. Newness, at this hour, is like a room with lights turned up too high. It makes you more alert than necessary. Familiarity is like the bedside lamp you turn on every night. You know where it is, you know how bright it will be, and you know it won't force your eyes wide open. This isn't laziness. It's energy optimization. The brain prioritizes conservation when resources run low. That's how it's designed. And when those resources fade at the end of the day, returning to the familiar is a deeply natural reflex. You don't owe the world another attempt at trying something new just to prove that you still can. New isn't always the right choice, and familiar isn't always the lesser one. Sometimes, the familiar is simply the option that best fits the state you're in. You don't owe the world another attempt at trying something new. But sometimes, you don't return just because it's easy. You return because it knows you. But there are evenings when you don't return simply because it's easy. You return because it knows you. Not familiar in the sense of having seen it many times, but familiar the way a well-known space understands what you need without asking. The movie begins, and at the same time, a very specific feeling arrives. Not excitement, not anticipation, but the quiet sense of, I've been here before. Nothing in the room has changed. The space is the same, the light is set just as it always is, the sounds are familiar, but you aren't. Years may have passed since the first time you watched this film. Back then, you might have been someone very different. Fewer burdens, fewer roles to carry, fewer things to hold in your mind, and when you watch it again, you're not only looking at a screen, you're touching a point in time, a place in the past where everything stayed still long enough for you to return without asking permission. There's nothing dramatic about this. No swelling music, no sudden return to childhood, just a calm recognition. Ah, I've been here. You don't go back to the past because it was better than the present. You go back because it was stable. Stable in a way that doesn't ask you to be a better version of yourself. In this room, no one is waiting for you to explain how you've changed. The chair is still there. It sinks in the same way it always has, but your body is different. Perhaps more tired, perhaps slower, perhaps carrying more than it used to. And because of that, this sense of familiarity isn't an escape, it's an anchor, a place to set down what you've been carrying all day. Some people worry that returning to old things will trap them in the past. But what's happening here isn't being stuck. You don't return to relive. You return to remember how you once learned to stand steady. This isn't nostalgia in the sense of longing. It's a form of recharging. Recharging the sense that you've been okay in different circumstances, that you've moved through different seasons of life and still kept something essential intact. This movie, in its quiet way, reminds you of something important. You don't start from zero every day. There is a version of you who once laughed at these scenes, who once sat in a room like this, who once felt safe enough to loosen their grip. That version didn't disappear. It simply stepped back so you could do what needed to be done. When you return, you're not just returning to a movie. You're returning to a familiar feeling within yourself. The feeling that you don't have to explain why you're tired tonight. You don't have to prove that you're still moving forward. In this moment, comparison stops. No one asks how far you've come. No one asks whether you should be doing better. The familiar sounds move steadily through the room, a small but unmistakable signal. Here, you are safe. Not safe because everything is perfect, but safe because nothing is judging you. And that creates a different kind of calm. Not calm because everything is okay, but calm because you're allowed to be exactly who you are tonight. You return to the past, not to stay there, but to feel steady enough for tomorrow. Like a ship returning to harbor, not to remain docked forever, but to restore what was lost at sea. The fuel isn't motivation. It isn't inspiration. It's the knowing that you've already crossed many seasons and you're still here, that you don't have to constantly update yourself to earn the right to rest. You don't need to become a newer version of yourself just to be allowed some peace. This familiarity doesn't pull you backward. It helps you stand steady before you move forward again. And if you sit a little longer with that familiar movie, it isn't because you don't want tomorrow. It's because tonight you're choosing an anchor strong enough to make tomorrow lighter. You don't need to update yourself to deserve rest. So what does this say about you when seen through a mature lens? At this point, there's something that needs to be named clearly. Returning to familiar movies is not a sign of laziness. It's a management decision. Not everyone is able to do this. Not everyone recognizes that there are moments when value doesn't come from doing more, but from not doing more. For a long time, many people were taught that moving forward always means trying something new, that better always means more. But that's only true when you still have energy to spare. When your resources are nearly depleted, wisdom doesn't live in pushing harder. It lives in preservation, and that's exactly what you're doing on evenings like this. You don't turn on more lights, you don't open more doors, you close things down, not because you're afraid of the outside world, but because this home, right now, is enough. Keeping the house quiet isn't a passive state, it's a deliberate act. You're saying no to unnecessary demands, not because you can't meet them, but because you don't need to. This is a rarely discussed marker of maturity, knowing when enough is enough. Not enough in the sense of giving up, but enough in the sense of understanding your limits and respecting them. Some people keep chasing newness even when they're exhausted, not because they're more curious, but because they don't know where to stop. You, quietly, have learned that. Rewatching isn't avoidance. It isn't turning away from the world. Most of the time, it's an act of restoration, a way to keep your system from overloading. Choosing what costs less isn't choosing something inferior. It's resource optimization. Just as you don't drain a battery completely just to prove it still has power, you conserve it, so it can be used tomorrow. You don't rewatch because you're incapable of taking in something new. You rewatch because you know when not to spend more. This is where many people blame themselves unnecessarily. They call themselves lazy, slow, behind. But those labels don't describe what's actually happening. What's happening is this: you're managing your energy, not with complex tools, not with loud strategies, but with one very simple choice: choosing what takes nothing more from you. Protecting quiet isn't always easy, and it certainly doesn't always earn recognition. You don't judge those who choose the new, and you don't need to justify your choice either. Both can exist. What matters is this: you understand where you are today. You understand that continuing to spend when there's no margin left comes at a far greater cost. So you stop, not because you can't go on, but because you choose to continue later. This isn't regression, it's strategy. A quiet one, but an effective one. And if you look at your choice from this perspective, you may find there's nothing to be ashamed of, nothing that needs fixing. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're simply someone who has learned how to stay steady in a world that always asks for more. You're not lazy. You're protecting your home. You don't need to blame yourself for the ways you keep yourself intact. Not "I'm lacking," but "I know exactly what I'm doing." The house settles back into its familiar rhythm. The bedside lamp is still on, not brighter, not dimmer. The TV stays on at a low volume. The sound is enough to fill the room, but not enough to pull your attention. Everything is exactly where it belongs. There's nothing new to understand, nothing to remember, nothing to react to. You don't need to follow along. You don't need to think about what this scene means. You don't need to ask yourself whether you should keep watching. You're simply here. The chair continues to hold your body in the same familiar way. Your shoulders don't need to stay lifted. Your breath doesn't need to be regulated. No one is waiting for you to do better. No one needs you to push a little further. Outside, the world keeps moving. But in this room, nothing is pulling you with it, and none of this needs explanation. The calm you feel right now doesn't come from everything being resolved. It comes from the fact that nothing is asking you to be resolved. No one needs a decision from you. No one needs an answer. No one needs you to become a different version of yourself. The familiar sound continues to drift through the room. Soft, steady. You don't need to pay attention to it. You just let it be there. In moments like this, calm isn't a big emotion. It's the absence of pressure, not because you've done enough, but because nothing is demanding more. This house doesn't ask how far you've come. It doesn't ask whether today was better than yesterday. It doesn't ask what you plan to do next. It's simply here, open, quiet enough. And if you notice, your body has already slowed down without effort, without intention, just by not having to do anything else. You don't need to make use of this time. You don't need to turn it into something productive. You don't need to recharge or prepare for tomorrow. Here, there is no right way to be. There is only one simple thing happening. You're allowed to be still. And perhaps this is one of the few moments like it in your day. No one is evaluating this choice. No one is measuring it. No one is praising or criticizing it. It doesn't need to be justified. It only needs to be allowed. If you're sitting here now, with soft light and familiar sound, there's nothing that needs to change. No final message. Nothing to remember. Just a moment where you aren't being pulled anywhere. Tonight, this is enough.